time now for perspective. Just over 2 years ago, former football star George Weah was elected president of Liberia, one of the world's poorest countries. His key promise: to improve the lives of ordinary Liberians. Last week, he marked 2 years in office, but there's growing frustration in the country at the dire state of the economy and still entrenched corruption. My guest today is Ibrahim Al-bakri Nyei, a Liberian activist and political analyst. He's also a PhD candidate at SOAS University in London. Thank you very much for speaking to us here at France 24. Could you tell us what exactly made George Weah so popular 2 years ago ahead of his election?
Well, he's connected to the grassroots base of the country, and during the war, he was the shining light, and he represented the country abroad when everything was dark in the country. And all the story about Liberia was about violence, brutality, and civil war. But then there was George Weah, who held the torch abroad and represented Liberia at the world stage. And so he became very popular, and he took the challenge of sponsoring the national team. And by doing this, he brought the country together in the midst of chaos, in the midst of the hunger, in the midst of the poverty. We had George Weah. That's what made him popular during the war.
So symbolically very important, but what about the policies he put forward? What appealed to people?
Well, his policies were about change, generally conceived, and he also promised to fight corruption. He promised to end poverty, and he challenged the status quo. For 12 years, he mobilized the young people, and he said, look, this is the time, and we need a new generation of leaders for this country. We've gone through a lot of chaos, we've gone through a lot of pain, and we need to produce a new leadership that will transform this country. And so that was a message of hope, and it was inspiring to the majority of young people, particularly those that come from the poorest of the poor and those that come from the slum communities, and people of my generation, my age, who didn't see the Liberians of the 1970s and much of the 1980s. So a good number of people in my generation saw George Weah as the last trump card for their liberation and their hope out of poverty.
And now many people are very disappointed with what the last 2 years have brought.
Well, I wouldn't say generally that many people are disappointed. He's facing his set of challenges of taking over a country where after coming from opposition in 12 years. And of course, yeah, there are opposition and there are challenges. He's facing those challenges. For example, we've had an economy that has fast declined in 2 years. Yes, of course, that necessarily would disappoint people, but he continued to inspire hope in the people with his speeches and some actions he's taken over time. Of course, some were very unpopular and actions that were necessarily meant to implement electoral promises, which were rushed. Some have backfired, but there are still glimmers of hope around.
But the economic downturn is significant in Liberia. What about the youth who voted for George Weah? Are they not frustrated at the lack of opportunities that have come about in the last 2 years?
Well, obviously, there will be some sort of frustration, but the prospect is that the government has, at some stages, announced that they are working around the challenges of the economy. For example, they've announced reduction in tariff for major commodities. They've made some steps to harmonize government salary and payrolls. Of course, that's going to be politically costly because it produces an immiseration of the working class in some instances. And again, there have been some effort in recent time to engage the International Monetary Fund to help with the stabilization of the economy. And some of the initial populist policies that produce this economic outcome we are having have been reversed. For example, he's making some efforts to reform the Central Bank of Liberia and to reform the economic management team. The last 2 years, of course, somebody coming from opposition after 12 years, he's been in a learning curve, and I'm sure he's learned so much lessons now to be able to reverse some of the bad policies and put in place the necessary policies that will transform the economy and stabilize the economy and get the Liberian people back to work, and particularly encouraging companies that were closing down and bringing in new investments. So the last few days, we've seen signing of new agreements with international organizations, and we look forward to see what all this lead to in the next 2 years.
And just lastly, I'd like to talk about about justice for victims of Liberia's two recent extremely bloody civil wars. A lot of people frustrated that some sort of national tribunal is yet to be set up.
Yes, and this actually the bone in the bonnet of the Liberian political class. There is a need for a war crimes and economic crimes code in Liberia, and every Liberian over the last few years, not even just the last 2 years of George Weah's leadership, since 2006, Liberians have demanded the establishment of war and economic crime code in the country to prosecute individuals responsible for committing mayhem against the Liberian people. And this is not going to be an easy policy to implement. A war and economic crime code will require a collective agreement of the political leadership. And interestingly, George Weah is actually in the bind of this political leadership. He made some alliances with people who are accused of violating human rights during the war. And to break up with these people and establish a war crime code is like shooting himself in the leg, like politically. For one of the most fierce warlords have threatened over and over that any attempt to establish war and economic crime code, he's going to take his voting bloc from the coalition that supports Weah. And he's also in an alliance with the child stealers faction. And that was one of the most brutal factions during the Civil War. He's carrying child stealer's wife as his running mate, his vice president currently. And to break out with that alliance and establish a war and economic crime code is also going to be very, very devastating for his political stability.
I'm so sorry, Ibrahim Al-bakri Nyei. We're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time, unfortunately. Ibrahim Al-bakri Nyei, a Liberian activist and political analyst. Thank you.